Hello everyone, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, don't forget to subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories like this. Now, get comfortable. It's time to dive into the story Zombie Outbreak on the Titanic, a horror at sea. Now, let's get started. I had never seen anything like her. The Titanic rose above the docks like a floating city, more palace than ship, her white hull gleaming against the April sky. They called her unsinkable. I didn't care much for the boasting. I was just a man with a ticket clutched in my hand and a family waiting for me across the ocean. Still, I couldn't help staring up at her in disbelief, wondering how something built by men could be so massive. I boarded with the second-class passengers, not poor enough to be crammed below, not rich enough to dine with kings. That suited me fine. I had saved for this voyage every coin tucked away from years of hard labor. My wife and children were already in America, and I was eager to see them again. This trip was meant to be a bridge between two parts of my life. The years of work behind me and something better waiting ahead. The first days passed in comfort I wasn't used to. Polished wood, warm meals, the hum of conversation from people dressed better than I'd ever managed. I walked the decks in the evenings, staring out at endless water, the cold air sharp in my lungs. For a while, I let myself believe the world was kind, that maybe fate had granted me a chance at peace. But unease lingered, subtle as a shadow. I noticed at first in the lower decks where the steerage passengers gathered. A man had fallen ill. At least that was the whisper passed around the corridors. Some said it was fever. Others claimed it was drink. He had been carried off by crew, his body limp, his skin pale as paper. No one spoke about it at the tables, but I heard the murmur of worry late at night when the ship's engines were the only other sound. The second sign came in the form of locked doors. Crewmen moved with urgency, barring certain passageways, speaking in hushed tones when questioned. I caught a glimpse once. Two men hauling another passenger, thrashing and snarling as though he were a mad dog. His eyes caught mine for a moment, wide and clouded, filled with something I couldn't name. The crew shoved him out of sight before I could react. They told me it was nothing, just a poor fellow overcome by seasickness. But seasickness does not twist a man's face into something monstrous. I tried to dismiss it, to focus on the vastness of the ocean and the comfort of the voyage. Yet at night, as I lay in my narrow bed, I could swear I heard more than the steady thrum of the engines. I heard cries muffled by distance. The kind of cries that carry pain and fear. Sometimes they ended in silence too quickly, leaving only questions that gnawed at me until morning. The Titanic herself seemed too grand, too solid for danger to reach us. That was what everyone said. What could harm such a ship? But I had worked in shipyards long enough to know steel was not the same as immortality. And the strange sickness spreading among a few passengers was not something you could patch with rivets or paint. On the evening of the fourth day, I stood at the rail staring at the stars. The air was colder than before, biting at my fingers, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. My thoughts were restless. A group of first-class ladies passed by, laughing, their pearls flashing in the lamplight. They seemed untouched by worry, but when their voices faded, I was left again with the endless sea and the weight pressing on my chest. Something was wrong aboard this ship. I felt it in my bones, as sure as I felt the deck beneath my boots. The Titanic was filled with life and light. But beneath that, it began with screams. I was finishing supper in the dining saloon when the sound tore through the air, sharp, panicked. Not the playful shrieks of children or the drunken laughter of men, but a sound that made my gut twist. Chairs scraped, heads turned. Then came the crash of glass shattering, followed by more cries, louder, desperate. The crew rushed to hush us, urging everyone to stay calm. But the calm was already broken. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring their protests, and slipped into the corridor. The air smelled different out there, metallic, sharp, like blood carried on the draft. Down the hall, a man stumbled into view. His suit was torn, his face slick with blood. He staggered forward, clutching at his arm as if it had been savaged by teeth. People gasped, reaching to steady him, but he thrashed like a wild beast, knocking one of them to the floor. Then I saw his eyes, clouded, empty, and yet burning with hunger. Before anyone could react, he lunged at the nearest passenger, his teeth sinking into the man's neck with a wet crunch. The screams that followed were high and piercing, and chaos burst like a dam breaking. People shoved past me, some running, some frozen in place. The dining room behind me erupted into a storm of panic as crewmen rushed forward with clubs and shouts, trying to tear the madman away. But it wasn't just one. From the stairwell at the end of the corridor, more figures spilled out. Crewmen and passengers alike. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, faces pale and streaked with blood. Some were missing pieces of flesh, wounds that should have left them dying. Yet, they walked. They didn't walk like men. They lunged, snapping jaws, clawing hands. The corridor filled with screams as the first group fell upon the living. I froze, my body refusing to move. I had seen fights before, seen men beaten half to death in dock brawls. But this was something no man should see. They weren't fighting to wound. They were tearing, ripping, devouring. The copper stink of blood hit me full, thick, and choking. That smell broke my paralysis. I stumbled back into the dining saloon, my chair clattering to the floor. The room was in chaos now. Women shrieking, men shouting, dishes smashing as people surged toward the exits. I joined the flood, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. The corridor ahead was blocked by crew, some armed with poles and axes from the emergency lockers. They tried to hold back the tide of snarling figures, but it was like trying to stop fire with bare hands. One by one, they were dragged down, their screams cut short. I turned toward the opposite stairwell, pushing past bodies, shoving aside anyone in my way. I reached the steps, my boots slipping on spilled wine and broken glass. A young man fell beside me, blood spraying from his throat, his eyes wide with shock. He reached for me, fingers trembling, but I kept climbing. Survival left no room for kindness. Up on the next deck, the panic spread like fire. People shoved against locked gates, pounding and crying as crew shouted orders no one obeyed. Mothers clutched children. Men cursed and fought to push ahead. Everywhere I heard the screams of the dying, followed by the guttural growls of whatever the sick had become. I stumbled into a side passage, chest heaving. The walls seemed to close in. The narrowness of the Titanic's corridors turning the ship into a trap. Behind me came the thunder of boots, then the sickening sound of bodies colliding. A woman's voice shrieked once, then ended in a wet gurgle. I pressed on, turning corners blindly. Everywhere I looked, the same nightmare played out. Blood smeared on walls. Passengers hammering on doors that would not open. Crewmen swinging axes. My breath came in ragged bursts, sweat dripping into my eyes. Through the thin walls, I heard the sounds of chaos, pounding feet, breaking glass, the hungry snarls of the infected. In that moment, it struck me. This wasn't illness. This wasn't madness or seasickness. Whatever it was, it spread faster than fire, turning people into monsters in the span of minutes. And it was here, trapped with us, hundreds of miles from land, on a ship that everyone said could never fail. I had no weapon, no plan, just a heart beating too loud in the silence of that tiny room. But one truth burned clear in my mind. If I didn't fight, I would die. If I hesitated, I would become one of them. And the Titanic was far too small to hide in forever. I didn't stay in that storage room long. The walls pressed in on me. The air thick with the smell of oil and damp wood. Every sound outside clawed at my nerves. The scrape of boots. The muffled cries. The growls of things that weren't men anymore. Hiding meant waiting to die. I needed to move. I eased the door open and peered into the corridor. Dim light flickered from a lamp at the far end, casting shadows that twisted with every movement. The floor was smeared with blood, dark streaks leading in both directions. I gripped the handle of the door until my knuckles turned white, then slipped out, keeping my steps light. The passage stretched ahead like a maze. I moved slowly, listening hard, every nerve on edge. A body lay slumped against the wall, his chest torn open. His eyes were still open, cloudy and glassy, and I couldn't tell if he was gone for good. I kept my distance. On this ship, death no longer meant rest. I needed something to defend myself. My hands were empty, useless against what I had seen. At the end of the passage, I found a fire cabinet. The glass was already cracked, but the axe inside remained. I smashed the rest with my boot and pulled it free. The weight of it steadied me. Cold steel, solid wood, something real to hold on to. I crept up the stairwell, every step groaning beneath me. Voices echoed above. Screams, shouts, the stampede of panicked passengers. I edged closer, pressing myself against the wall. On the landing, a group of people were hammering at a locked gate, their fists bloody from the effort. Beyond the bars stood a pair of crewmen, ordering them back, shouting that it was for their safety. But behind the passengers, more of the infected poured in, teeth snapping, arms reaching. The crowd surged, trapped between iron and death. I didn't wait to see how it ended. I turned down a side passage, heart slamming in my chest. Every corridor felt the same. Narrow walls, patterned carpets already soaked through. Doors that might hide salvation or slaughter. Once I stumbled into a cabin where a man was hunched over, rocking. His hands were covered in blood. When he looked up, his face was torn and twisted, lips peeled back in a grin that wasn't human. I slammed the door before he could rise. His fists hammered against it as I ran. The air grew colder as I climbed higher. I knew I had to reach the upper decks where the open air might give me space to breathe, where maybe lifeboats were already being readied. The Titanic was massive, but every hall, every stairwell felt like a trap. Too many bodies, too many corners, too many shadows that moved when they shouldn't. I passed a woman huddled with her child in a side alcove. She looked at me, eyes wide with terror, whispering prayers I couldn't hear. For a moment, I thought about stopping, but the sound of snarls from down the corridor pushed me forward. I couldn't save them. I could barely save myself. The ship groaned around me, the sound of its mighty engines carrying through the steel. Above, I could hear the faint echo of orders shouted into the night, the distant rush of feet on deck. Hope flared. If I could reach the top, I might find order, or at least escape. But as I climbed another stairwell, a figure stumbled into view. His uniform marked him as a crewman, but his face was wrong, jaw hanging loose, eyes glazed. He lurched toward me with a guttural snarl. I gripped the axe with both hands, the wood slick against my palms. When he lunged, I swung. The blow landed hard, the axe biting into bone with a sickening crunch. He fell, twitching, his blood pooling dark across the carpet. My stomach turned, bile rising, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford weakness. Not here. Not now. I stepped over his body, gripping the axe tighter. My heart raced, but my mind was clear. The Titanic had become a labyrinth of death. But somewhere above, there had to be air, space, and maybe salvation. So I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, deeper into the belly of the ship, hunting for safety that might not exist. I moved quickly up the stairwell, gripping the fire axe until my knuckles turned white. My ears rang from the screams below. The Titanic was no longer the ship I had marveled at days before. It was a coffin filled with metal corridors echoing with footsteps and desperate cries. When I reached the next landing, I stopped. My chest ached from the climb and from the pounding of my heart. For a moment, I pressed my back against the wall, forcing myself to breathe slowly. That was when I heard it. A soft sobbing, muffled, coming from one of the cabins nearby. I should have kept moving. The smart thing was to stay quiet, to stay hidden, but something in me wouldn't allow it. I followed the sound and stopped at a half-open door. Inside, a woman sat on the floor with two children clinging to her arms. Their eyes were red from crying, but they were alive, unbitten. She looked up when she noticed me, her face streaked with tears and terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not sick, are you?" I shook my head. She exhaled sharply as though she had been holding her breath for hours. The children buried their faces deeper into her dress. "We tried to run," she said. "They locked the gates. They said help would come. But no one came. I had seen the bodies piled at those same gates. I knew no one would come." My mouth opened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I simply said, "You can't stay here. It's not safe." Her eyes darted to the axe in my hand, then back to my face. I saw the unspoken question. Could I protect them? Could I get them out? My stomach turned. I thought of my own family waiting across the ocean. My wife's face came to me and the laughter of my children. I wanted to help this woman and her little ones. Every part of me screamed that it was the right thing to do. But I also knew what it would cost. Moving with them meant slowing down. It meant noise. It meant dragging fear and weakness through corridors where only speed and silence would keep me alive. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just stared at them, torn in two. "Please," she whispered again, her voice cracking. I crouched down so I was level with the children. They wouldn't even look at me, too frightened to raise their eyes. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to promise them safety, but my throat tightened. The truth weighed too heavy. "I'm sorry," I said at last. Her face crumpled as if I had struck her. She pulled the children closer, her shoulders shaking. I stood, feeling my legs weaken under the weight of my own words. "You need to stay quiet," I told her. "Barricade the door if you can. Don't open it for anyone. Not for anyone." Tears slid down her cheeks and she nodded without looking at me again. I stepped back into the corridor, pulling the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the axe and forced myself to move. Each step felt heavier than the last. The ship groaned around me, metal straining against the weight of thousands of lives, living and dead. Every cry, every thud of footsteps pressed into my skull like nails, but none of it cut as deep as the silence I had left behind that cabin door. I reached another stairwell and paused at the bottom of it. My arms trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the decision I had made. In my mind, I replayed the image of the children's faces buried against their mother. Would they survive? Or had I just sentenced them to death? My stomach churned. I pressed my forehead against the cool steel rail and closed my eyes. I told myself I had no choice. I told myself I couldn't save everyone. But no matter how many times I whispered those words in my head, they didn't feel true. Somewhere above, another scream cut through the ship, high and sharp. It snapped me back to the moment. Survival demanded movement. Hesitation meant death. I opened my eyes, tightened my grip on the axe, and began to climb. Each step upward felt like a betrayal. But each one also brought me closer to the chance of seeing my own family again. That was the knife I had to live with. And as I moved, the ship itself seemed to groan louder, as though it too carried a burden too heavy to bear. The climb upward became a march through hell. Every deck I reached was worse than the last, as if the ship itself had turned against us. The corridors, once polished and gleaming, were now slick with blood and broken glass. The chandeliers rattled with each groan of the hull, swinging shadows across the walls like specters guiding the dead. I gripped the axe tighter, moving low and slow, my ears straining for any sound out of place. There were plenty. The shuffle of infected feet dragging over the carpet, the wet coughs of throats torn open, the screams, those were worst of all. They came sharp, then cut off too soon. I passed through a lounge where overturned tables made a crude barricade. Behind them, bodies lay scattered, some torn apart, others slumped with eyes open and clouded. A pistol rested in the hand of one man, his fingers stiff around the trigger. He had saved his last bullet for himself. I reached for it, but the chamber was empty. He had beaten me to its mercy. I moved on. At the next junction, the air stank of smoke and iron. A small fire burned in a waste basket, spreading to the drapes. The flames hissed when I slipped past, and their glow revealed the truth of the corridor ahead. A cluster of infected swayed at the far end, gnawing at something collapsed between them. The sound of tearing flesh made bile rise in my throat. I froze, holding my breath, praying they hadn't heard me. But one lifted its head, its face smeared crimson, eyes milky and dead. It let out a low groan, and the rest followed. They began to shamble toward me, hands outstretched, jaws dripping with red. I didn't run. Not yet. Running drew too much attention. Instead, I gripped the axe with both hands, steadying myself. The first lunged, mouth wide, arms clawing. I swung hard, the blade sinking into its skull with a crack that echoed through the hull. It dropped and I wrenched the axe free, blood spraying across the wall. The others surged forward. I backed up, hacking, swinging, striking wherever I could. One grabbed my arm, its nails tearing into my sleeve. I drove the axe straight into its neck and shoved it aside. Another came from my blind spot. Its weight slammed me against the wall, teeth snapping inches from my throat. I jammed the axe handle into its mouth, forcing it back with a desperate roar. My muscles screamed, but I heaved forward, slamming the thing against the railing until its skull cracked open. By the time the last fell, I was gasping, my arms heavy, the axe dripping. My heart thundered so loud I thought the whole ship could hear it. I stumbled away down another corridor, nearly tripping over a body. A young man, maybe no older than 20, lay on his back. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. His stomach was torn open, and I could already see the color draining from his skin. His eyes met mine, wide and terrified. "Help me," he rasped. I knew what was coming. I had seen it too many times already. His lips trembled as he tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. My grip tightened on the axe. One strike and I could spare him the fate waiting in the next few minutes. But my body wouldn't move. My chest clenched as I thought of my own children, of how they might look at me if they begged for help. I couldn't do it. Not this time. I stepped back, shaking my head. His eyes widened in horror and then they went slack, the change already taking him. I turned and ran before he rose. Stairs loomed ahead, leading to the higher decks. I forced my legs to climb, taking them two at a time despite the fire in my lungs. Halfway up, a hand shot out from behind the banister. Fingers clawed at my ankle, dragging me down. I kicked hard. Boot cracking bone and swung the axe down in a wide arc. It split the skull of another infected that had been hiding there. At the top of the stairwell, I burst through a set of doors and into the grand dining saloon. My breath caught in my throat. The place looked like a battlefield. Chairs were overturned, tables smashed, food and silverware scattered across the floor. Bodies, living and dead, were everywhere. The infected swarmed over survivors, dragging them down in a frenzy of teeth and claws. Screams filled the air, mingling with the sound of china shattering and wood splintering. A man in a tuxedo swung a broken chair leg, fending off 3 attackers. He struck one, but another lunged onto his back and tore his throat out. His gurgling cries drowned beneath the chaos. I knew better than to charge through the middle. Keeping low, I hugged the wall, weaving behind columns and broken furniture. Every second felt like a gamble. An infected staggered within arm's reach, but its head snapped the other way, chasing a shriek from the far end of the hall. I crept past, my breath held so tight it hurt. Near the exit, the way was blocked. A cluster of them swarmed a man who had fallen, his body already being torn apart. Blood pooled beneath him, slick and shining in the dim light. I clenched my teeth and pushed forward anyway. With a roar, I swung the axe, cutting through rotting flesh and bone. One fell, then another. The third lunged and I shoved it back into the table with all my strength before splitting its head clean open. I staggered through the door, chest heaving, sweat stinging my eyes. My arms felt like they would snap from the weight of the axe. But I had made it. I was still alive. Behind me, the screams of the dining saloon echoed. A chorus of the damned. I didn't look back. Not once. The corridors narrowed the higher I climbed, the air growing colder and thinner, as if the ship itself were trying to squeeze the life out of me. My arms ached from carrying the axe, but I refused to let it go. Without it, I was already dead. I reached a landing where a porthole offered a glimpse of the night outside. The sea stretched into blackness, endless and silent, the stars sharp and cruel in the sky. For a moment, I pressed my forehead against the glass. Out there was freedom. Out there was escape. But between me and that dark water lay hundreds of bodies, living and dead, blocking every path to survival. I pulled away and kept moving. The ship groaned beneath my feet, louder than before, as though it were warning me of what was still to come. The outbreak was only half the nightmare. Something else was building, waiting just ahead. I passed through a gallery lined with artwork and fine furniture. Chairs lay overturned and blood smeared across the marble floor in jagged streaks. My boots crunched over broken glass. A faint sound caught my ear. Movement, light, but hurried. I froze, raising the axe. Then I saw them. A group of survivors huddled near the far exit. 3 men and a woman, all clutching bits of wood and metal torn from the wreckage around them. Their eyes widened when they saw me, and one lifted a crowbar defensively. "I'm not sick," I said quickly, keeping my voice low. They hesitated, then lowered their weapons, though their shoulders stayed tense. The woman stepped forward. "You're headed up?" she asked. I nodded. "There are boats," she said. "Lifeboats. They're preparing them on the upper deck." For the first time since the chaos began, I felt something stir inside me. Hope. Thin and fragile, but still alive. I thought of my wife, of my children waiting for me in America. If I could reach one of those boats, maybe I would see them again. Maybe this hell would have an end. The others looked at me as though expecting me to lead. I wanted to say no, to keep moving alone, but the thought of numbers gave me pause. Alone, I had nearly been torn apart more than once. Together, maybe we had a chance. "Stay quiet," I told them. "And don't stop moving." We pressed on as a group, slipping through shadowed corridors and up narrow staircases. Every creak of the floor made my skin prickle. Every groan of the ship sounded like the dead closing in. Twice we had to stop, holding our breath as infected stumbled past an intersection. Their heads jerked, their jaws snapping. But by some miracle, they didn't catch our scent. At one stairwell, the youngest of the men, barely more than a boy, tripped, his cry echoing like a gunshot. A door burst open ahead and 2 infected lurched out. I swung the axe before they could reach him, burying the blade in one skull, then the other. Their bodies collapsed at my feet. The boy looked at me with wide, grateful eyes. I didn't speak. We didn't have time for words. When we reached the next deck, a blast of cold air hit us. The upper levels were closer now, the lifeboats within reach. My lungs burned, but I forced myself forward. Every step carrying me closer to salvation. That was when the ship shuddered. A low, grinding vibration rippled through the hull, shaking dust from the ceiling. The survivors around me froze, their faces pale. The sound was deep, unnatural, like the groan of something vast being torn apart. For a moment, even the infected seemed to pause as though the Titanic herself had cried out in warning. The others looked at me, panic flickering in their eyes. I clenched the axe, forcing my voice steady. "Keep moving," I said. "Whatever that was, we don't stop." We pushed on, hearts pounding, shadows shifting around us. Salvation was so close I could almost taste it. But in my gut, I knew the worst was still waiting. The stairwell rattled beneath our feet as we climbed. The air sharp with cold. Every step felt like it could be the last. The ship groaned louder now. Not just the sound of metal straining, but something deeper. As though the ocean itself was dragging the Titanic down. Water was coming whether we reached the boats or not. "Faster," I urged, my voice ragged. The survivors followed close, their faces pale in the dim light. The boy I had saved earlier clutched a broken table leg like it could shield him from the monster swarming the decks below. His hands shook, but he didn't let go. We reached a landing where the gate was half torn open. Beyond it, the corridor stretched toward the upper deck, but shadows moved inside. The infected had reached here, too. The first one staggered into sight. A woman still wearing a fur stole, though her throat was ripped open. Her head jerked toward us, lips curling back in a snarl. Behind her, more followed. Their moans filled the air like a warning. "Run!" I hissed. We bolted. Boots hammered against the carpet as the infected surged behind us. I swung the axe at the first that lunged, the blade splitting its skull with a crack. Blood sprayed the walls, but I didn't stop. Another lunged from the side, arms clawing. The boy screamed. I shoved the creature back and kept moving, the others crowding close. At the end of the passage, a door burst open. Crewmen in torn uniforms spilled out, but their eyes were wrong. Cloudy and hungry. They blocked the way like a wall of corpses. "Back!" the woman in our group shouted, panic in her voice. The corridor was closing fast. Infected behind, infected ahead. "Trapped," I roared and charged. The axe bit into the first crewman's skull, then ripped free with a spray of gore. I shoved another aside, the impact jarring my shoulder. The survivors pushed through the gap I carved, kicking and striking, desperation, giving them strength. The woman swung her metal bar into a skull, shattering it. The boy slammed his table leg against another, screaming as he struck again and again. We broke through, leaving the bodies writhing on the floor. I didn't look back. Looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant death. Up another stairwell, the cold grew sharper, biting at our skin. A gust of freezing air rushed down the steps. We were close. The door burst open and we stumbled onto the open deck. The night sky stretched above, clear and cruel, stars sharp as knives. The air was filled with shouts, sobs, and the creak of David's lowering lifeboats into the black water below. Crewmen barked orders, their faces pale but resolute. The sea lapped hungrily at the sides of the ship, climbing higher with every groan of the hull. But the infected were here, too. They swarmed the deck, chasing survivors toward the rail. One woman shrieked as she was dragged down, teeth sinking into her shoulder. A man tried to leap into the water, but hands caught him first, pulling him into a storm of claws. "Get to the boats!" I shouted. The survivors followed, weaving through chaos. My arms felt like lead, the axe heavy, but I swung anyway. Every strike a fight for breath, for life. One of the men in our group was caught, teeth tearing into his arm. He screamed, begging for help, but we couldn't stop. His cries followed us until they were swallowed by the night. We reached the lifeboats. Crew shouted at us to wait, but I shoved forward. "Let us in," I yelled. Behind us, the infected poured from the stairwell, dozens of them, snarling, sprinting. The boy stumbled. I grabbed him by the collar and hauled him up. "Move!" The crewmaning the ropes hesitated, eyes wide at the horde closing in. I didn't give him time to think. I swung the axe at the nearest infected, its head snapping back as it fell. "Lower it," I roared. "Now!" Something in my voice must have convinced him. The boat began to drop, ropes groaning. The woman and the boy climbed in, gripping the sides like their lives depended on it. I shoved another man in after them. Then, hands grabbed me. Cold fingers dug into my arm. I twisted, driving the axe down, splitting bone. Another came from the side, snarling, teeth snapping at my neck. I shoved it back, my chest burning, the edge of the boat just steps away. "Come on," the boy screamed. I ran and leapt, landing hard in the lifeboat. My shoulder slammed against the wood, pain flaring. But I was in. The crewmen cut the ropes, and we dropped into the icy black. The Titanic loomed above, its lights flickering, its deck swarming with the dead. Screams echoed down, blending with the groan of tearing metal. The great ship shuddered as if taking its final breath. The woman clutched the boy, sobbing into his hair. The man beside her stared upward, silent, his face as pale as the moon. I gripped the axe, my knuckles white, watching the Titanic sink into shadow. The ocean swallowed the screams. Only the creak of the lifeboat and the distant wail of the dying remained. We had escaped the ship, but the night was vast, the sea endless, and the night seemed endless. Our little boat drifted on the swells, the sea black as ink around us. The Titanic was gone, swallowed by the ocean. But the screams lingered in my ears long after they had faded into silence. We sat huddled together, too cold and too empty to speak. I clutched the axe across my knees, its blade dull with blood. My hand shook, though whether from the cold or the memory of what I'd done, I couldn't tell. The woman whispered prayers into her boy's hair. The other man stared blankly into the dark, his lips moving without sound. Hours passed. The stars wheeled above us, sharp and cruel. I kept glancing at the horizon, searching for a light. They had said another ship was near. They had said the Carpathia would come. It was the only thought keeping us alive as the sea gnawed at our boat and the cold crept into our bones. Then, just as the first hint of dawn touched the waves, we saw it. A glow on the horizon. Lanterns, smoke, a ship's outline breaking through the gray. The Carpathia. Relief surged through us. The woman sobbed, clutching her son tighter. The man let out a ragged laugh. The sound wild but full of hope. I felt tears burn my eyes. We had made it. Against every nightmare the night had thrown at us. We had survived. As the ship drew closer, we waved, shouting hoarsely, our voices cracking in the cold air. Figures gathered along the rail. Dark shapes silhouetted against the morning light. I saw arms lifting, hands raised, mouths open in greeting. For a heartbeat, it felt like salvation. Then the wind carried their cries to us. Not words, not shouts of comfort. Groans, low, guttural, hungry sounds. The figures swayed unnaturally, jerking and twitching as they leaned over the rail. Even at a distance, I saw the way their jaws snapped, the way their arms clawed at the air as though trying to tear us closer. The Carpathia was here. But it wasn't a rescue. It was another grave, drifting toward us, filled to the rails with the dead. The woman's sobs turned to screams. The boy clutched her tighter, eyes wide with terror. The man beside me dropped his head into his hands, muttering in despair. I could only stare, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. The Carpathia loomed larger, its decks crawling with the infected. Some had torn uniforms. Some still wore gowns and suits, their bodies swaying with the roll of the sea. Their eyes found us clouded and ravenous. We had prayed for rescue, and rescue had come. But the world beyond the Titanic was no better. The sickness was everywhere. The ocean, the land, the sky, all of it carried the weight of a world already lost. I tightened my grip on the axe, the wood biting into my palm. The boy whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. The Carpathia bore down on us, its shadow falling across the waves. The groans of the damned rolled over the water like thunder. There was no escape, only the end. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams.